Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, once we come together to explore what it means to stay human in the digital age, I believe we already intuit that there's a potential that we won't. And that means I believe that in human history, we saw already what it means not to stay human. So if we have a look, what are the terms that we could put and agree on when we say staying human? So maybe we can agree on that the world is a warm place, that there is love, there is compassion, there is honesty, there is connection. And what does it mean not to stay human? Maybe it means that the world becomes a cold place. Maybe it means that we are less connected or disconnected, dishonest, violent, uncaring. So these symptoms that I mentioned right now, I believe many of them have a common denominator, and that's trauma. So we are living in a world where we see an amazing explosion of the development of technology, and that certainly brings a lot of breakthroughs and benefits to our life, that is clear. And at the same time, I believe the increase of speed and complexity of data can create an enormous pressure onto our nervous systems. And so I believe when we don't take the trauma factor in account when we use and develop technology, I believe we could end up in an unsustainable development. And so a nervous system that is integrated and healthy can transform that pressure into development and evolution. But when we already experience trauma and we are overwhelmed, I believe that increase of speed and complexity of data can create enormous side effects like heightened levels of anxiety, heightened levels of stress, disembodiment, and disconnect. So when we see, for example, the World Wide Web, the news feeds send lots of trauma news around the world. And so when there is already pre-existing trauma in us, when we hear and see those trauma events, I believe many of us cannot fully digest that information. When you just look in your own life and all the information that you are being exposed to, that you consume, do you feel that you can still feel and digest what you experience? Do you feel that your body is still synchronized with the speed of data that your mind consumes? So, what is trauma? Trauma is not the event that we experience, but trauma is the response of our nervous system to an overwhelming situation. And trauma is actually a very intelligent function, because trauma has been developed throughout thousands of years of human evolution in order to help us to survive better, to stay in a place of action and choice in overwhelming situations. Trauma goes usually hand in hand with two major symptoms. One is that our nervous system goes into a state of hyperactivation, so there's a lot of stress, and at the same time we shut down parts of our bodies, our emotions, and our mental and relational capacities. And this leads to a numbing and also to a relational disconnect and disembodiment. So when we think of trauma, we might think of shock trauma, when somebody has a car accident or when there's violence or shooting. But there is another very widespread level of trauma, and that's attachment trauma. So the human attachment process is a very sophisticated but also fragile process, and it can be hurt. So the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study, it's a long-term study on childhood experiences, shows that more than 50% of the children of this country actually experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. 20% of our children had two. So when physical, emotional neglect, abuse, domestic violence, divorce, and many others. So this has severe side effects. Attachment trauma leads to attention deficiency, physical and mental disorders. It leads to heightened addiction rates, substance abuse, and nowadays, of course, the abuse of the use of technology. So when there is another very important level of trauma, I believe, and that's collective trauma. So collective trauma happens when a country is at war, or when there is a genocide, or when there is slavery, racism, or big natural catastrophes, maybe. And I believe that's a very important aspect of trauma, because I believe most of us, in one way or the other, have been born into the aftermath of a collective trauma. And neuroepigenetics professor Isabelle Manzoui of the University in Zurich found out in her mice experiments that traumatized mice pass on trauma to the next generation through epigenetic changes. And that means that the next generations of mice display the same trauma symptoms without ever going through a trauma themselves. So this might mean that many of us suffer, in a way, individual issues and symptoms that are actually part of a collective trauma field. So in science, there is still a debate whether trauma is being passed on genetically or epigenetically or not. But what I have seen in the work with thousands of people all around the world and with big collective trauma processes, I'm absolutely certain that it's true. So what are the consequences of trauma? First of all, trauma hurts our capacity to relate, because it is often inflicted through inappropriate relation. So it hurts our capacity to relate to ourselves and to self-regulate. Also, our societal regulation functions. And our baseline stress levels are higher, and we feel more overreactive in situations, and we burn out faster. And trauma also hurts a human being's time, space, and rhythm coherence. So this goes out of balance. And we are more disembodied and more numb. And the important thing is, I believe that trauma is an invisible guest. So trauma is visible only through its symptoms. And I believe that trauma can stay deeply buried in our bodies, in our nervous systems, in our psyches, and stay there for decades. So what is the potential that we have today? I believe the cure for trauma consists out of different factors. So the first factor is that we simply become more aware. First of all, that we become aware how massive the extent of trauma is in our society. And secondly, that we learn to read simple trauma symptoms. The second point is that we improve our relational capacities, because trauma is very often inflicted through inappropriate relation. The cure for trauma is through appropriate relation. So we can, in a way, train our capacity to relate, to deeply listen, to feel each other when we communicate, and to increase our relational presence. Actually, neuroscience says, in the polyvagal theory, that the frontal part of our central nervous system, the frontal part of our vagal nervous system, is actually deeply relational. It means that when we hold and embrace our children, when we deeply listen to our children or to another human being, this part of our nervous system actually helps to and down-regulate stress. We all know this when people deeply listen to us and really care. So that's what every parent does with their child. And so that's why a relation is actually deeply healing. And the other point is that our nervous system is like a wireless through our body. And when we allow our nervous system to really attune to another nervous system, we create a coherent field. And that coherent relational field is a data connection. And so when we communicate, we first establish an appropriate data connection, and then whatever we say is being received properly. The third point is inner awareness or presence. That's something that we can train. We can practice meditation, contemplation, yoga, tai chi, mindfulness, and other practices in order to really train our nervous system to rest in deeper states of presence. And then we have the digital revelation. So through the World Wide Web, I believe, we created an external manifestation of our inner architecture. So we created a global brain. And because of the global brain, we have a new perspective, a new consciousness onto humanity and the world. And because of that, I believe that the digital restoration is now possible. That means if we use technology to help us to integrate trauma, we have a very powerful partner. And so when we use technology and develop technology, and at the same time we are trauma-informed, and we take this trauma factor in account, I believe we can literally restore trauma in the world. And this means that we can navigate the digital age with awareness and relatedness. And what that means is that we can extend our capacity to relate when we write an email, when we send a text message, when we post on social media, that these people are not out there, but that we really relate to the people and feel them as if they were in the room with us. And I believe this, again, creates the fact that the cyberspace becomes a warm, intimate, and related internet. So that technology actually becomes the extension of our capacity to relate. And because relation is the #1 factor in curing trauma, I believe when technology is our partner, we can not only integrate individual traumatization, but also our collective traumas in the world. Thank you.